Good afternoon. Welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Bronwyn Maddox, the Director of the Institute, and we're very pleased to be having this discussion here on the manifestos and how they stack up. May I say right at the beginning, we're very conscious of the awful events in Manchester and the fact that the campaigning has been suspended, at least for the moment. We've decided to go ahead with this discussion because the issues clearly still hang there. We've lost, because of those events, two of our panelists, unfortunately, Adam Bolton and Phil Collins, but I'm delighted to be joined by the panel we've got here. Joe, who's head of the political and social research at YouGov, and as I was saying earlier, is really the front man of YouGov on many of these things, talking about how people are responding to this and what they're thinking. Julian McRae, Deputy Director of the Institute here, who's been working on the things that we would like to see as the Institute from the manifestos, and put out a piece with us last week on that. And Nick Timmins, who many of you will know is a senior fellow here and at the King's Fund, and long-standing commentator on health and social policy issues. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and it could not be more relevant, the kind of things we're going to discuss. Well, we're going to kick right off with each of them speaking briefly. And really what we're trying to get at today is how these manifestos stack up, not just in terms of whether they're going to win support, but really in terms of their claim for the party's ability to run the country well, and for being able to square the kind of difficult propositions that any party has to put to the electorate at the moment. The tension between national finances and the kind of expectations that people have, and the kind of costs to public services, and the desire of leaders to bring a personal and campaigning and passionate sort of flavour to their manifestos, and the overwhelming task of Brexit that hangs above any party, any leader who's taking government after this election. So we're going to plunge right into that, and I've asked Joe to start and say what you make of it.
Thank you. Excuse me. Well, firstly, I'd like to say something about manifestos. Why do we have them, and how are they used? I can tell you how they're not used. There are very, very few people in this country who are diligently downloading a copy of each party's manifesto, reading each one from cover to cover while making copious notes, and then coming to a considered decision about which party they want to vote for. If that does happen, it doesn't happen very often, and I would suggest that the people doing it are perhaps not entirely normal.
Instead, they all work here.
Or they all work here, or perhaps both. Or they're perhaps here today, so thank you for coming. Manifestos are important, however, for events like this, for us to get an idea of what it is the parties are thinking about, what it is they at least hope on some level to work towards, and for us and others to dissect, to discuss, and then in future to hold to account. We come into this election with the Conservatives leading on virtually every policy issue. And so when you look at the various different things like health, education, taxation, the economy, etc., etc., the Conservatives lead on everything with the exception of health and housing. Those two policy areas are the ones that Labour leads on, but even then, only just. And so the individual policies, yes, they play into people's perceptions of the parties and indeed of their voting intention, but they're not actually the be-all and end-all. The average person in the street, and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street, isn't paying a lot of attention to the minutiae of the detail, of the specifics. Instead, they're thinking about the broad stories, the narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves and each other about the parties. Which do we think can be effective? Who do we think we can trust? Who will be strong and perhaps stable? Who can be good for people like me, for the country, and so on and so forth. And the individual policies do feed into that, but actually manifestos for the voters are much like a restaurant. You go to a restaurant and you look at the outside and the menu hanging on the door, and yes, you might like some of the dishes on the set menu, you might dislike some others. But the point is that if the restaurant itself doesn't look so great, you're probably going to look for somewhere else to eat. And that's the way to think of manifestos. When it comes to the particular policies, though, in this election, the most popular, with 79% of the population thinking it's a good idea, comes from the Conservatives, increasing NHS spending by a minimum of $8 billion over the next 5 years. Generally speaking, you never lost votes in this country saying you were going to increase spending on the NHS. And so, similarly, requiring non-EU migrants to pay more to use the NHS. 70% of people supporting that. Capping rents so they can only rise in line with inflation, popular one for Labour. Increasing the living wage to 60% of the median earnings, again Conservative. So, popular policies there supported by a majority of the population. The other end of the scale, we have ruling out the European Union without a trade deal. Fewer than a third of people support that Labour policy. Reducing the voting age to 16. Under one in three adults, I should stress, from 18 upwards, support that Lib Dem policy. But the award for least popular manifesto pledge this time around goes to the Conservatives, with replacing free school lunches for all infants with free school breakfasts for all primary school children. 23%, fewer than a quarter of people thinking that's a good idea. So the individual policies, some are popular, some are unpopular. They're useful for us to look at, but people aren't really paying much attention. Casting a shadow over all of this, though, is of course Brexit, and the implications that Brexit will have both on public opinion about the various policy areas, the various parties, the politicians, but also these particular policies. That cloud is enormous. It's worth remembering that, yes, the country is still broadly divided down the middle, as it was at the time of the referendum last year. And so in our most recent polls, and we have consistently asked people if they thought it was right or wrong that we voted to leave the EU, the results are basically 50-50 once don't knows are excluded. There has been a bit of switching, tiny bit of movement both ways. There's fluctuations as things go along, but generally speaking, that picture has not changed. However, when you ask people whether Britain is right or wrong to now go through with Brexit, you have a proportion of people, nearly half, who believe that it's right to go through with Brexit because that's what they support. You then have an additional significant proportion, around between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 people, who believe that even though they didn't support it, it is right the result of the referendum should be respected. And so that means you have between 2/3 and 3/4 of people believing that Brexit should occur, either because they support it or because they respect the result of the referendum. And so the interaction between those two different bits of public opinion data, I think, could have huge implications, not just for whether these policies are implemented, but indeed for politics in this country for many years to come. And then, of course, we have the question of austerity. We have the issue of an ageing population. We have the issue of cuts needing to be made, etc., etc., etc. Generally speaking, the public still seems to be on board with that. The concept that austerity needs to take place, that the books should be balanced, and indeed at least one of these manifestos was at least fully costed. And so that's still something that the public believe is important. So how Brexit and how the austerity agenda, as I say, cast a shadow over these policies, over these manifestos, and over whatever government we produce out of this process will be an important thing to keep an eye on. Thank you.
Joe, thanks very much indeed for that. And I'm going to come back a bit later in this discussion to this interesting question of austerity and the fact that people are still very much on board, as you said, for the project of balancing the national finances, even though it looked a couple of years ago as though parties might make a more sustained argument for borrowing more in a time of low interest rates. But as you said, public opinion is where it is, and parties, both of the main parties, seem to be taking on that obligation. Before we move on, though, I want to ask you one thing. What we should make of parties' claim to have a mandate. A mandate for what?
Well, I mean, technically, the argument will be made that everything that is in the manifesto was supported by the electorate. That is the suggestion that politicians make. I think it's untrue. The difficulty that politicians have is that when they break manifesto promises, they're accused of not fulfilling their mandate. But they're more than happy to add additional things in, and
as for example Margaret Thatcher did, the privatisation famously not being in.
Yeah,
I think which one of the things she's most known for,
and so,
not being in the manifesto.
And so these are a broad guideline, and yes, you can hold governments to account, but ultimately most governments get away with breaking manifesto promises The obvious exception being the Lib Dems and tuition fees, where they are still suffering as a result of that. But generally speaking, they can get away with it under certain circumstances.
Okay, thanks very much. Julian, let's come on to you. And your tests, and indeed the IFG's tests for not a comprehensive list, but our key ones for whether these make sense.
Great, thanks, Marlon. And I'll follow up on Joe's analogy. I'm probably a particularly finicky eater of manifestos off this menu, looking at some particular sort of elements inside it. We set out something a couple of weeks ago, which basically talked about, priorities. What can you see about, is a government capable of prioritising? What will we get on Brexit about the ability to get that mandate, but also insights into, the approach to the challenges of implementing this. On taxation, we had a budget not that long ago which illustrated the danger of particularly binding tax pledges. Would we be seeing that repeated or not? On infrastructure, a whole set of major issues which actually have been going on in this country for literally almost generations now, but certainly decades, looking at those. Would we see a route way through them? And finally, public services. A lot of pressures building up inside public services. What will be the approach of parties? And how would they deal with the tendency of our policy making and certainly our manifesto processes to get us into very wishful thinking about how easy it might be to touch on these. So I'll run through each of these just briefly in turn, making a couple of quick observations, but I'm sure the discussion will fill out some of these points. As you might expect, manifestos are not great for prioritisation. Though I have to say, with the Tories, we did get the 5 giants. And I'm conscious I'm sitting with Nick Timmins, the author of the 5 giants from the original beverage list. But they are rather different. But I think they do show that a very strong sense of continuity. You can see what Theresa May has been talking about and what she is attempting to build as a set of policies, particularly the ones about more social integration, dealing with demographic change and things like that, and the economy coming through in a particular form. Very clear. Real question's going to be, still, is this too much? There's an awful lot in Brexit. There's an awful lot, Nick will talk, I'm sure, about some of the pressures on social care and NHS, which are hardly resolved. Will that, we've got it down to 5 key headings, but is each of those headings just still possibly too big going forward? Labour produced a much more straightforward list. You almost do the public service headings, a great tradition of sort of policy through 12 chapters. Again, a sort of question inside that. There's an awful lot on that to-do list. Is there that sense that, the tasks that come up, particularly around Brexit, have you got a sense of the actual capital, the space and time that's going to take up going forward? One thing, interesting, Bronwyn said, no one is promising to borrow huge amounts more, particularly in this election, unless you count Labour's 250 million sort of elements of a version of the golden rule for those who enjoy their public finance rules in the UK, going back to Gordon Brown. But it is, I think, to me, very striking reading the manifestos, the degree to which that austerity is no longer really the core driver of a political battle. There's a lot more nuance and breadth in some of the economy chapters from what I remember from 2010 and 2015. And the interesting question is really, what are these parties saying about its reaction function? If things go wrong, what are you going to do about it? And my guess is that what we've actually seen since 2010, both these manifestos are basically saying, if something goes wrong, we'll borrow some more, because we seem to be able to get away with that. That'll be my guess of what they're teeing up for in this space. On Brexit, again, we didn't learn much really from the manifestos. There's very clear differentials between the 2 main parties on this, and very clear gaps in types of things that really the public probably should know about. We can talk about no deal, but unless you have a sense about what the cost of no deal is, what does an even worse deal look like that we might reject? And that will, I'm sure, continue to play as we go forward. Actually, whichever party goes through. Labour have set some conditions on what they wouldn't accept a deal without that, but what does that mean? It raises similar kinds of questions about where you go. And that sort of sense of, do we see anything about the policy issues in here? Implementation issues like immigration. It's clear what the policy set is, but it's difficult to find anything in the implementation commentary, a few words that might suggest the various parties get just how long it will be for the UK to build its own immigration system from scratch. I mean, just a report from my colleague quite recently on this, which was looking at, do we have the capacity even to process 3 million EU nationals in the country to establish identity so that they can come in and out of the country as we move to a new system. Currently, our system is not capable of doing that. We're going to have to build something completely new. And again, those kind of key things not necessarily playing. And the question was, in the making commitments, do the parties, for example, Labour, commits essentially to removing a lot of the enforcement mechanisms for our current immigration system, raises the stakes again on implementing a new one. Very briefly on tax, right to get rid of very, very tight prescriptions. It was a stake in the 2015 manifesto to have the tax lock in there. And I think that lesson has been very recently learned. Labour may have felt politically that it needed to go into that territory somewhat more on tax side and ruling out various things, though of course at the same time raising tax massively. Infrastructure, there was some welcome clarity on various projects. There was a lot of speculation beforehand, and useful that manifestos made it clear whether they wanted to definitely go ahead or definitely end various things. What was, I think, probably disappointing from our particular dining viewpoint, there was no reference to National Infrastructure Commission, a very good thing. It was in the Labour and Lib Dem manifestos, but it wasn't referred to in the Conservative manifesto. Hope that this will naturally continue. Finally, on public services, I'll leave to Nick a lot of the detail on some of the issues that have obviously come up in the campaign. I think one of the things that we were interested in was this importance about the assumptions that are going into public service, the forecast that we can deal with things, and a sense of what's credible. I think the Conservative manifesto ended up by not actually having the costings inside it and not giving us a real sense. Still some confusion as to exactly what different numbers mean, what their baseline is, how they're acting. That may just reflect how rapidly the Conservatives had to put together their manifesto, but I think it illustrates also a bigger point. Again, 2015, treating a manifesto, even if you've had years literally to perfect it, as an implementation plan, as the 2015 Conservative government did, is probably a mistake. And it's really quite important that these manifestos are treated, a little bit as Joe was alluding to, they are political documents for a purpose. They give us a sense of priority, but trying to translate them directly into implementation plans would probably not be a sensible idea, particularly given the degree to which there aren't the independent validation that some of the assumptions you've made in a small, closed room are actually going to translate into something you can actually do.
Julian, thanks very much indeed. It's something we've discussed a lot at the Institute, which I've written about as well with my colleagues, is if you look at these manifestos, if there's one mistake they make, it is probably to underestimate the scale of Brexit and to attempt to do all kinds of things with a very personal flavour, as we've seen, particularly with the Conservative manifesto, and then indeed with Jeremy Corbyn's kind of forward to the text of the Labour manifesto, but they just don't seem to acknowledge the scale of Brexit in terms of the cost, where even just the exit bills that are being talked about are bigger than a year of the extra spending that Labour is proposing, the impact on people's lives, the speed with which this is coming down, and the impact on all kinds of other legislation and taking up parliamentary time and so on. And so while we've given them all kinds of ticks and reprimands, as Julian was sketching, to me that's the flaw in both of them, that Brexit so much dominates that the question of whether you can bring another agenda to this, on top of all the business as usual, like saving the health service, really looks deep in the territory of wishful thinking. But we can discuss this more. Nick, you're on top of what is the row of the week.
Social care, yeah.
Social care and health and funding of all this.
Yeah, okay.
What should we make of it?
I'll come to that in a second. Just the first point I'd like to make is that austerity is how far it's fallen off the agenda, in a sense. It's been the driving thing for the last 6 years. The Tories the coalition Tories said they'd eliminate it by 2015. Labour said they'd halve it. The Tories actually managed to halve it. And now we've seen the time of getting the books balanced drift slowly out, and now it's all the way out to 2025 in the Conservative manifesto. And with that, as pointed out on the Conservative side, there's more room for manoeuvre to raise tax. How do you balance the books? You cut spending or you raise tax or you increase borrowing. It's clear the tax burden is going to rise after the election anyway. If they really want to do some of the things they say they want to do, this applies to all three parties, but also the Conservatives, strikes me taxes are going to have to go up, or we end up running a very long deficit, which includes increasing our debt, which leaves bugger all room for manoeuvre if something else really goes wrong out there, which could include Brexit. So I think there's been a big shift in the austerity thing. It's not driving it in the same way.
The language, as you say, it isn't, but it's hanging out there.
It's hanging out there, but it's not being talked about in the same way, and I think that's quite a significant shift. I'll do health in two bits. One first of all, simply to say, well, they're all signed up to the principle of an NHS free at the point of use and no provision for new charges. That's not been true at every election in the past, so that's common ground. And there's the promise of more money, but you can't work out from the manifestos quite who's promising more or what because the numbers aren't clear. More money, but I suspect most people in the NHS would say still not enough money, which brings us around to the question of social care. Social care bit is extraordinary in the sense that the Conservatives didn't have to say anything about it. They'd already promised a green paper for September, and they could have said, we're going to have a green paper on social care. And they have, in theory, another policy sitting on the shelf, which was still not, which had been postponed to 2020. I mean, it looked to me like it had been canned, but technically it had only been postponed. Why did they have to get into this territory? And when they got into it, why did they have to get into it in the way they have done? Which has clearly had a lot of bad reaction, may appear to have shifted the polls a bit. And now, as of yesterday, it appears we're back into something that might recognisably be Deal Not territory again. We're going to have a cap on the upper end. Quite where it will fall and what it will involve is unclear. And it's interesting that even if you have that, there's a kind of a second, that there are two problems, two issues in social care. One is who pays. And Deal Not is really all about who pays and how people can protect themselves. It's not necessarily about pumping more money into publicly funded social care services. In other words, running social care will cost the government more because it will be protecting more of people's assets and savings, but that in itself does not increase the level of provision. And if you look at what's happening within the NHS and the lack of social care provision, that clearly has a knock-on effect. So you can have a debate about how far you protect people from the bills of this, but what that doesn't do is necessarily drive more service. And what's been happening in social care is the number of people getting help has been shrinking and the quantity of help has tended to shrink. There's kind of 4 grades of social care: critical, severe, moderate, and I can't remember what the other is. Nobody gets the other mild. Almost nobody gets moderate. More and more local authorities are only helping people with critical needs. So you can do something about who pays for it, but that doesn't necessarily massively increase the level of provision, which has its own knock-on effect to the NHS. And just one other thing, back to health. There's an intriguing bit in the manifesto where it says, if the current legislative landscape for the NHS is either slowing implementation or preventing clear national or local accountability, we will consult and make the necessary legislative changes. This includes the NHS's own internal market, which can fail to act in the interests of patients and creates costly bureaucracy. Now, I think that's quite remarkable. Back in 60th anniversary NHS, Kenneth Clarke, who introduced the purchaser-provider split, said if one day it turns out that we can't make commissioning work, then we've been barking up the wrong tree for the last 20 years. Well, that kind of begins to say precisely that. It's not that commissioning is going to disappear entirely, but the purchaser-provider split and the emphasis on choice and competition, which was a huge... what effect it had is debatable. It was a huge policy driver in the Labour years. Lansley's white paper was seen to be all about that. More private providers, more choice, more private providers, more choice and competition, and it's all fallen out of the lexicon. In Lansley's white paper, the word choice, patient choice in various forms, appears 39 times, and in Simon Stevens' 5-year forward view, it appears 7 times, and it's mainly around choice of what sort of treatment you get, not necessarily where you get it. Word competition's in the white paper 7 times, it doesn't appear at all in Lansley's 5-year forward view, and it's just sort of dropping out. So we're kind of watching 25 years of policy, if not being turned on its head, at least dissolving before our eyes.
It was the same for education, same language for education.
Yeah. that's where I was going to stop.
Right. Well, let me just ask you on that. Where you think we are in this quarter of a century of discussion about this. I mean, people have been, this is almost a point of arithmetic, not ideology. People have been able to say for a long time, look, healthcare costs are rising about twice as fast as GDP, and so if we're going to try and pay for it out of tax, this is really going to get very, very difficult at some point. People have obviously had all these efforts to make the health service more efficient, to try and get people healthier and reduce the demand, and keep coming around to this thing that is both a sort of marvellously trite political phrase of a public conversation or an honest public conversation, but also it has some force, because it is a discussion now between politicians and the public about some rather unpleasant truths in there, as well as all the scrambling around you're discussing about whether we can organise health differently and squeak some more out of it. Where and this has been going on for a long time. It's not as if people haven't been able to see the problem coming. Where do you think we are in this discussion?
Well, there's quite a lot of discussion as you phrased it. There's a distinct shortage of policy proposals to tackle it, unless you count the social care bit where more people would have to pay for social care. And indeed, I've been slightly surprised, given the pressure the NHS is clearly under, how little large public discussion there has been about changing the funding system. And by that I don't mean necessarily having a hypothecated health tax. I mean changing the funding system so that people pay more towards healthcare in one way or another. And there's not really been we haven't reached that stage of that debate. It hasn't really happened. And there have been plenty of times in the past when that debate has been around. I remember that being in the middle of the 1990s. That was huge. Which is the last time the NHS was under the sorts of pressures we're seeing it under now. But it's not really been there. There's the sort of thing, we have to think about this and it all looks rather difficult, we need to consider it. But there's not really been a set of concrete policy proposals knocking around all over the place about changing it.
Well, we'll come on to that. I mean, and come on in discussions to education, where, I mean, as we were just discussing, in terms of university fees.
Which may come back to the problem that, what is it that makes Britain British? And the NHS is right up there on the pedestal.
But then you get to the dementia question and whether it is simply people with dementia have to carry their own costs, which is the Dilmot thing. Joe, where do you think we are on this question of, you said at the beginning, you thought the public was on board for the sense that national finances were a constraint and something that governments need to worry about. Is that your feeling, right across the board, taking in the kind of things we're talking about here, which is health?
Yeah, I think that, the first point I would make is that the public doesn't have a very well thought out view of these things. That's indeed many things, but this thing particularly. And so there is a broad, and by no means universal, but a broad recognition that the numbers have to be balanced. That firstly, you can't spend what you don't have. That's the first thing. And then the second element is that some degree of cuts needs to take place. That in carrying on the kind of language that we heard in 2010, but certainly in 2015, in the national interest, it is the right thing to do to cut back the amount of spending that we're doing. Now, whether you cut that back in order to balance the books or whether you cut that back to pay off your deficit, that's the kind of thing that the public don't understand. These are just broad narratives that they largely support, that spending should match income, and that some degree of cuts need to be made. Those are both broadly brought into. Now, whether the cuts need to be supported for reasons of economic austerity or whether they need to be supported for ideological reasons, again, it gets complicated. Then. But in terms of the broad narratives, that's how it looks.
Julian, you've been leading our work on not just public spending, but the performance side of it. An excellent document called Performance Tracker, which I recommend to you. Next one out in October. What do you think government could do better about this element of not just allocating public spending, but actually controlling what comes out the other end?
Yeah, well, I think that this really is going to be an issue. I mean, the Labour Party have effectively said we will spend a lot more money across a huge range of public services, and that is one route to take. You've got to hope your taxes come in, and I know the IFS and various people I've worked on corporate taxes and business taxes when at the Treasury. not exactly 100% secure you'll get that money. So it's an interesting question there about the borrowing. If you look at the Conservative manifesto, it's essentially taking the strategy that has been running for quite some time now, since 2010, of trying to control public services and control the expenditure on them, but actually maintain the quality and indeed scope of those public services. And that worked very well in the first few years past 2010. There's quite a lot of evidence that we drove increases in efficiency across a large number of public services. And there's a lot of evidence that that was done by basically squeezing quite tightly on workforces and on organisations. So you saw quite a lot of reductions in headcount without necessarily affecting the quality of the service. And you saw quite a lot of pressure to hold down wages. Where the pressures have really come, something like the NHS, huge demand pressures coming in. So even though hospitals have more funding, we haven't actually managed to change the system we've been talking about for 20, 30 years. How do we stop the demand coming into hospitals so we can refocus on preventative care and things like that? It's all remained that sort of sense of wishful thinking, maybe we can change this system, and we really haven't succeeded in it. It's interesting what Nick was saying. We're watching strategies for reform that we've kind of held to for, literally dozens of years, slowly fading away. But actually, where's the next strategies coming from? And that's the bit that seems to me quite empty. There's some little hints at it. I think the fact that the health plans are bottom-up plans, being driven by local areas, is a good thing. But the investment you would have to put into getting serious bottom-up driven plans, which national level politicians would actually accept the conclusions from, as opposed to try and dictate them, we're still quite a long way from that. So, an entire new philosophy almost is demanded for the scale of the challenges we face if we want to keep that balance of controlled spend, but keep the performance of our public services going.
And if you talk to people in the insurance industry, you can get them quite easily to say rather radical things, like we're looking at something they call the end of inheritance. They say, look, this is the last generation that is going to, middle class is going to hand on, and can fulfill this dream of handing on a family house onto children and so on, and actually people ought to expect that to pay for not just dementia, but their cancer care and all kinds of stuff. They don't charge around town saying it very, very publicly because it is fabulously unpalatable, but that is the kind of model they're working on.
Well, they would be, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
I mean, what do you expect them to do? They can have an insurance market for this, it's good for them.
Yes, but as they point out, this is something, and this gets to the point of the row of this week. If you're suddenly dealing with things that you can't insure against, as you said, who pays? Is it, and this goes to the heart of the Dilnot row, is it simply the afflicted person who pays, or is there some social way of pooling those costs, particularly of end of life? Where do you think the sort of political discussion is on this?
Well, I mean that's what the debate is about, isn't it? So, how far do you pool these things? NHS. I mean, if you look at the NHS as one giant insurance scheme, really, big national insurance scheme, is effectively what it is, funded from general taxation. As Dilnot pointed out, I thought quite sensibly and reasonably, social care costs are about the only big risk in life you can't insure for. And essentially what he was trying to do was create an insurance market. It was interesting, none of the products had appeared by 2015 when it was due to start to come in, and I've never could get a clear answer out the insurance industry why that wasn't why that hadn't happened. The explanation is that they will appear, no one's going to design a product in detail until this actually happens. So if you have a £75,000 cap for the sake of argument, you will then design a product that does that, and those products aren't going to appear until this is actually a reality. The other possibility is they wouldn't design the products. And I don't know what, they just won't do it.
Yes.
But I've no idea which of those is the case.
No, well, we can have a separate discussion on that, an event which is worth having, but the spectacle of the country limping up with 6% rates for equity release in an era of almost zero interest rates is very striking. Let's go to some questions which cover a wide range of things, I think. Is there one here? No? Have you got a question? Yep, at the right, and then I'll come.
Picking up on something that Joe says, and I'd like to ask all the panellists really, including you, Bronwyn, do you agree that we're in a particular era of party manifestos being retail politics, i.e. sort of attracting the voters with the biggest bag of sweeties that you possibly can, whether it's the Tory manifesto or whether it's the Labour manifesto, Green or UKIP.
Thank you. And would you like to say who you are for the record?
Bonnie Soames, Parliamentary Radio. I'm also a fellow at the Centre for Business Research, University of Cambridge.
Great. Who'd like to go first? Okay.
What I would say about, from the public's point of view, or rather from the point of view of the relationship between the parties and the public, why are manifestos important? They're important for attracting attention. So you have your launch, and then you have, if you're lucky, in the case of Labour Conservatives, a couple of days of uninterrupted coverage. If you're unlucky and you're the Lib Dems and you launch in a East End nightclub on one night and then the next morning the Conservatives release, you get very little in terms of attraction. And so that's what they're used for. They're used to attract attention, they're used to hog the limelight, and they're used to start conversations. In terms of documents that are then that they're then held to, I imagine the politicians would prefer it if they were largely forgotten. But I am speculating there.
Is politics more for sale than ever before? Is it about what you give the electorate?
No, I don't. In terms of the specifics, I really don't think it is, because most people aren't paying that much attention. The reason social care and the Conservatives has become important, I agree with Nick, as somebody famously said. I don't understand why they put it in their manifesto, but the reason that has become important is not because of the specifics around social care. The reason that has become important is because suddenly the aura, the narrative around strong and stable and trustworthy and competent is beginning to be questioned, and that's why it's important. It's being used as a proxy for that. The actual policy itself is not important. And similarly, it's not about selling the public specific things. It's about selling the public a picture of yourself, which you use the manifesto to paint.
Yeah.
Julian.
I think it's kind of important that, in a world of policy wonks that have sometimes written manifestos, they get obsessed by the policy detail and have we covered off everything else. And I think, as Joe says, these serve very different purposes. And actually, it's not just the UK. If you look at countries which have got themselves into quite deep holes in their public finances, as we did back at the end of, around 2008, 2009, elections there very seldom set out, this is the way we're going to actually deal with this deficit. They were much more about, this is the image we want to present, this is the type of values we hold as a party that's coming in. Action was taken usually for countries that have been going on for a decade with a public finance problem, a chronic public finance problem. They're eventually driven by the market. And that's the interesting thing that's actually missing from UK politics at the moment. It seems that the market is prepared to lend us money at historically incredibly low rates, so the conditions, the constraints on our politics are not as strong as they would normally have been in many previous situations.
I'm not sure they're more retail now than they have been. I mean, the different, Labour's 1983 manifesto, the famous longest suicide note in history. If you want to talk retail, that was stuffed with things that Labour was going to do if it had won. But there are different moments, aren't there? I mean, Julian's point about the 2010 election, everyone said, it was clear there were going to be massive cuts on the way. None of them would tell you what they were going to cut. I remember sitting there with Chris Giles on the FD tearing my hair out, trying to sort of get someone to tell us, what are you going to remove? Huge. So, and also there are different moments in time. If you go back to Labour's 1997 manifesto, which goes to your point, crucially, I think, it was all about trust. I mean, this is a little pledge card with 5 tiny little things on it. And basically all that manifesto said at great length is, we will earn the money before we spend it, and we will restore the public realm. And that's really all it said. So it was all, that was all about trust. Was Labour to be trusted with the economy and get on with it?
Well, we saw where the Edstone took that technique of campaigning. I agree with Nick that there's an element of it. It was always thus, of parties trying to win support. I rather disagree with everyone here, and that I think and agree with what I think is the thrust of your question. That I think there has been a shift towards a more kind of consumerist approach to politics. People say, what are you going to give me in return for my support, and a more transactional sense. And then you add to that, obviously, we live in a very shouty age, and people are not arguing their way so much to these positions, but listening to the bubbles of sound that come their way. And you do have something perhaps different in tone from what was 20 or even 10 years ago. But, there has to be, these were always sales documents, and I think that is an enduring quality. Let's go to another one. Here in the front.
Patricia Rawlings, regarding the manifesto, nobody really reads the tiny detail, but the press is really what actually sets the agenda for them. But I wanted to just, Bron was talking about Brexit, and it's a 50-50, in fact, or whatever you like to call it. And I wondered whether you thought there were effects that, do people mind that in fact they now realise that every foreigner is not going to be sent away, and that actually we're not going to take back control of every piece of legislation as was promised? Do you think that when that will eventually sink in? Funnily enough, campaigning on the doorstep, people don't seem to mention it, Brexit, really at all. And then finally, just one quick question on the National Health. There's obviously never ever enough money for the National Health Service. What about a Royal Commission looking into restructuring of the National Health Service?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for raising the question of Brexit, which I wanted to go into more detail on, and we'll come to your particular points as well. Who'd like to plunge in? Look, what are people feeling about Brexit in this? You've got the Leavers, and you've got this large pool of Remainers who are now convinced that it should go through.
Well, I would say, you have the Remainers, you have the Leavers, and then you have the Relievers, as we've called them, this group that believes it should take place. But ultimately, nothing has happened yet. That is the important thing. There have been various discussions, there have been various debates, and there have been various suggestions, but nothing has actually happened. And when people will start to notice, when the realization will hit, when the penny drops, if you like, will depend on when things actually start to happen. Because at the moment, and you're right, and it was actually the same. It was a very similar story with austerity. If people weren't actually feeling directly the input of austerity, then they were far more likely to support it, because they were saying, oh, right, well, yes, I think this is necessary, and it seems to be doing effectively. It's not affecting me, but it seems to be working. And so there are innumerable things that have to be sorted out. The interesting point is that you have this 48% of people that voted to remain. You have the Relievers, but then once the negotiations take place, that's when it gets complicated, because you have, among those 52%, a large number of people who believe that what they want to change will change, and what they want to remain the same will remain the same, and that will be true at an individual level. And that is problematic, because you're right. I think we can all agree, and most people will agree, that foreigners will not be sent home, for want of a better expression. But there are some people within the people who voted to leave who do think that we should pull up the drawbridge and all immigration should be stopped. When it becomes clear that's not going to happen, or at least we assume that's not going to happen, what does that mean? We have a percentage of, in fact, a majority of people who believe that it is better to have no deal than a bad deal. Well, firstly, what does a bad deal mean? It means different things to different people. And what does exit mean? Actually going on to WTO levels, so that we're on the same level as, I don't know, a country like Botswana. Will people actually be happy with that when it happens? Probably not. But all of this is hypothetical, all of this is theoretical in some cases as well, and so it's extraordinarily difficult for people to get their heads around. And lots of things will happen, lots of changes will occur, many of things will please people, some people, many things will upset others. But until something's happened, we don't know what effect that will have. And at the moment, there's a lot of very positive views about, for instance, Theresa May's new custom deal, new trade deal. The assumption is that that will be in favour of Britain, and that will be good for us. Well, what if it isn't? What if she's not able to get a good deal? What if the actual deal is not good for people on an individual level? Then it starts to bite. But you're right, that could be for years.
With the manifestos, with all the manifestos, does Brexit feature at all in any of them?
Well, not to anything like the kind of detail that would be needed to answer these questions, but crucially, not in any kind of detail that any government that's formed could be held to account on it. That's my interpretation.
Julian, go on.
And just in this, I mean, there's kind of some interesting interactions. I mean, this is choosing the team that's going to negotiate. It's a similar sort of thing to who's going to do the cuts to your public spending or get your finances back in control. It's not that surprising that no one set out this is precisely what we're going to do, and these will be the unpalatable realities. Now, Joe's talked a lot about the policy decisions, and there's inevitably going to be a reality dawning coming out of this. But there are other things that are going on here which are slightly more within government control, even within that policy frame. If you take immigration, when I worked on this in government, we had a really fascinating chart about the polling level of concern about immigration. And it was an upward trend, but it wasn't just a steady upward trend. It spiked pretty much around when we lost control over something, very obviously. So foreign national prisoners was one, but there are about 4 or 5 different occasions where that happened. And you saw a jump in the polling of about 10 percentage points. And then it came back down over the next period about concern about immigration, came down by about 5 percentage points, but it ratcheted up. And one of the elements for a government, of course a load of these elements, is not just there's a policy set of trade-offs for a government that comes in. Yes, there are, and there are going to be people disappointed, people happy, nature of politics. But there's a competence, and is this government in control set of trades? And if that's your retail message that you're getting at a top level coming out of your manifesto, then actually having the capability to be in control so that you actually can register 3 million Europeans, you can have some assurance that these are the right people and there's not going to be an article that we got that wrong, and that we have some way that business can be helped with allowing people into the country to do jobs we want, but actually we have other rules which are going to prevent the things that you've said that you want to prevent. That will be something that actually government has much more ability to affect than necessarily some of those political trade-offs that is suggested.
I mean, there are some things that under Britain's unilateral control. But in answer to the question, I mean, the Labour has said, look, we think no deal is a very, very bad idea. The Conservatives have repeated their comment that no deal is better than a bad deal, not defined. Lib Dems want to stay in. But I think by our book in the IFG, they've all been very, very light on saying anything about life after Brexit, how they might organise the country after we come out, once those terms are established, things like farming and so on, and really been enormously light on the detail of how they're going to get there, what they're going to do with the devolved nations, all these kind of things. And so all kinds of things that they actually could spell out right now, they have chosen not to. Now, they might say that improves their negotiating freedom, but it doesn't give voters an awful lot to go on at this point. And as you said, there may be something in the final deal for everyone to dislike, which will be an interesting political predicament. Nick, do you want to come in on that? Or on the Royal Commission for
on the immigration, the only thing I'll say on the immigration thing is I think I find the single most gobsmacking thing in any of the manifestos is the pledge to get immigration down to tens of thousands again. I mean, why? Something you proved you can't do.
Didn't say by when.
It doesn't say by when. No, I know. But people talk about damage to politics, and there's the famous Lib Dems and tuition fees. And the damage to politics, saying we're going to get it down to tens of thousands when you haven't done for 7 years. You haven't even got down the bit you can control, which is non-EU immigration below 160,000. I just think it's crazy. Anyway, on a Royal Commission for the NHS, all I would say is, good Lord preserve us. I mean, I really don't think we need a Royal Commission on the NHS to look at structure. The endless reorganisation of the NHS structure has been one of its biggest and longest problems over the last 20 years, and it's probably quite clear that a certain number of things need tweaking, but I don't think you wanted someone to sit down and say, how do we design the way this works from the top all over again? Need to amend a little bit of what is there, and a Royal Commission would not be a good way to do it, I don't think.
Thank you. Another question. Should we go in the middle there, and then we'll come to the front here.
Hi, I'm Anne Perkins from The Guardian. I wonder if the panel thinks that Brexit's going to be a permanent new watershed, new cleavage in British politics, and if so, whether the Tory manifesto and the kind of repurposing of the Tory party was an attempt to prepare it for that eventuality.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the last bit of it. That the manifesto
was part of the Tories positioning themselves as the party of the leavers, and all that conveys in terms of the political agenda.
Interesting.
If you look at the Lib Dems, they certainly hoped that was the case. My take on it is that they hoped that Britain would realign along the lines of Brexit in the way that Scotland realigned along the lines of the Indy referendum, and that they would be able to scoop up Remainers who were previously voting Conservative and Labour and so on and so forth. I think that will happen in a few constituencies potentially. So areas like Cambridge, areas like Bath, constituencies like Twickenham, that could have an effect. But at a national level, it doesn't seem to be the case. That doesn't mean that Brexit isn't a cleavage in this country. I just don't think it's the cleavage when it comes to party political voting at the moment. It may re-emerge as I say, as things start to happen. But at the moment, although there are dividing lines, it clearly is not. Even when you control for lots of other things, it's actually age which is emerging as the important cleavage rather than other things. Now, of course, age also had a bearing on Brexit as well, but it's that way round rather than the other way round.
Okay, great. Another question? No, right here in the front.
Hi, I'm Finn Bode from the German Embassy. I've got a question probably towards you, Joe. You've spoke about a broad public support for austerity measures that is still around. I was wondering, so in Germany, for example, you can hear voices usually from the left side of the political spectrum saying we can borrow money very cheaply at the moment. Why not use it now and invest in, for example, infrastructure? I was wondering, are there any divisions among the support or for the support of austerity programs or measures along political affiliations or maybe education? Are there any divisions? And do the manifestos appeal maybe to voters who feel differently about austerity?
Well, the manifestos don't really mention austerity. I mean, my take on it is the manifestos don't really mention austerity in a great deal of detail. What I would say is that it is a range, and while broadly speaking, the country believes that cuts are necessary and so on and so forth, it's by no means the whole country. Young people tend to be much less favourable towards such things. They continue. There's a certain group of young people who continue, and it's quite large, who continue to feel that they have been let down by the older generation, not just in terms of austerity, also in terms of housing, also in terms of Brexit. These are the people that will refuse to get up for older people on the tube now, and so on and so forth. And so there's a major divide on age, which goes back to the previous answer. But there is also a divide in terms of ideology. And yes, there have been some campaigners on the left of the political spectrum, but who believe that actually spending and then borrowing is more important. But it's not a sort of widely articulated things. I don't know if the other two want to comment on that in more detail. But it's not a major prevailing wind.
Julian, do you want to say anything on that?
I think where we're heading to on this is actually quite interesting. The sort of debates I think are fundamentally shifting from a raw austerity sort of debate. We've got to get the public finances under control. We were on the brink of bankruptcy in 2010 when actually we weren't on the brink of bankruptcy, but it was a useful metaphor and it did feel true to people. We're now 7 odd years in. We've got a growing economy, but still quite a big deficit historically. Now, there's a world in which we roll forward, we continue to grow, we deal with our deficit as most countries do through ultimately a load of growth. And there's a world in which, are we really going to get through the next 5 years without some kind of global downturn or something along those lines? And they're very, very different worlds. The preparation for that inside our sort of system of government, and how do we get people bought into it? Goes back to some of the discussions we were having earlier. OBR is talking about 8 percentage points of GDP needed to deal with demographic pressures over the next sort of 50 years or so. That's starting now. You can see it coming out in what's happening in our public services. Have we got a politics that's capable of actually engaging people and drawing together the political debates we really need to have? Or have we got a politics that wants to control this debate? It's actually scared of where this might end up. So it wants to give you very specific, fine-grained policies on social care that have been done behind closed doors. And that I think is the kind of maturity question that we've got about how we're going to actually utilise some of those debates. Some of the work the Institute did a long while ago, the success factors of fundamentally changing public policy positions range from the minimum wage when it came in to smoking bans to the devolution settlements for Scotland and Wales. If you look at those, you find that the party politics of Whitehall, Westminster and the policy processes of Whitehall are pretty much irrelevant. It's civic political actors who take most of the debate forward outside of those realms. And it's an interesting question as to where those civic actors are getting to at the moment inside British politics, because they do seem to be slightly missing from some of the driving of our political thinking at the moment.
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, what the wrapper is, what the debate, the limits are on government at the moment. I think we're in a slightly sort of fudged bit of ideology at the moment. People don't talk about austerity overtly anymore. It's gone with George Osborne. But they haven't really signed on explicitly for, look, let's not worry about the deficit and go out and spend lots on infrastructure and so on. And there's a chunk of that in the Labour manifesto, but still there's an awful lot of language about fully costed, even if it isn't. People are trying to have it both ways and not signing up, if you like, to one ideology or the other. And it seems to it's something that is worth kind of preserving in national debate, because some of the big pressures we've been talking about, say, are long-standing pressures on health, all kinds of social commitments that have built up in layers since the Second World War. I mean, nothing to do with the 2008 crisis. Those are still there. Governments have to work out how to pay for these and how to have a dialogue with the public about whether or not to pay for these. And unless we're going to have a grand bonfire of the promises, ripping up sort of 70 years of social contract, governments are going to have to inch their way through this. But exactly what they feel about debt and deficits at this point seems to be not clear. Just grateful that the era of low interest rates has gone on as long as it seems to, though they are edging up. Nick, do you have some last thoughts? And we're coming right to the end.
No, I agree with a lot of that. I've just got one thought about people project all these numbers forward and say they all look dreadful. One of the reasons the elderly care one looks dreadful is dementia. Something might happen. We might find, if not a cure, something that slows it down dramatically in the next 10, 15 years. Not impossible. That would change all sorts of things. I mean, for a start, it would become a healthcare cost, not a social care cost, because you could do something about it. So the money moves over there, and you might well be spending less because you're not spending huge amounts on care. So, crossing your fingers and hoping that is going to happen is probably not a sensible piece of public policy, but it's far from impossible that will in fact happen. And it will shift the boundary of the debate. It will become a healthcare cost, and it will be smaller. Just a passing thought.
Not just a passing thought. I must say, just because the incentives are so great and the stakes are so high, the kind of working assumption that inroads will be made into the treatment of dementia in 20 years seems to me a good bet. I'm determined to end on an optimistic note. Thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate this on this difficult day in politics and in national life. We're delighted to have a very good discussion, this panel here, and I think there's probably a few minutes to catch people for other questions afterwards, but thank you again very much for coming.